Hello and welcome to episode 73 of Level Up Your Career. 60 minutes of live Q&A where your questions and votes drive the show. Use the Slido link in the chat to vote up the questions you want answered and of course to add your own. Level Up is live Mondays at 8 a.m. and Fridays at 2 p.m. UK time. Live stream to both YouTube and LinkedIn. You can find out more about what we do by visiting apmg-international.com. I am Shanice Mitchell-Cox and I will be your host for today's show. I'm delighted to be here to talk about how to become a data protection officer. Of course, in a data-driven world, we are all responsible for protecting data, but today we will discuss how to become the officer who oversees the management of data protection. So let's jump in and meet our panel who are waiting for your questions. We welcome 5 panellists today. A welcome return to Lynnette Kelly. Lynnette is the Data Protection Officer for APMG International. She has worked for APMG for 18 years and for the past 6 years has been involved in governance and compliance. Welcome, Lynnette.
Thank you, Shanice.
And we are also joined by the returning panellist, Etienne Shardlow, who is a senior consultant and lead trainer at Symphonise Consulting, with a specialist focus on the governance of IT and emerging technologies. It's great to have you back on Level Up, Etienne.
Yeah, good to be here. Thank you for having me again.
Anytime. And our third returning panellist is Sarbojit Bose. Sarbojit is the owner and director of Training and Consultant Services. Wonderful to see you, Sarbojit.
Thank you, Shanice. Thank you for having me back.
Always a pleasure. And a warm welcome to Ramiah. Ramiah has a vast experience and expertise in many domains, such as compliance and auditing for cybersecurity, privacy, business continuity, and cloud. Welcome back.
Thank you, Shanice, for having me. We have a great presentation today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And completing our panel today is David Clarke. David is the CTO at the Trustbridge and the founder of GDPR Forum with over 21,000 members. David is an internationally known GDPR and security advisor. Welcome, David.
Thanks a lot, Shanice. Great to be here. Superb panel, and I've seen some of the questions coming up, and they're really good.
Wonderful. So let's get started. Now, to all the folks watching online, don't be shy, introduce yourself and where you're from in the chat, and let's get your questions coming into the panel. And our question master for today is Suchitra, who joins Bangalore in India.
Hi, everyone.
Hi, Suchitra.
Good to be back here. Hi, Shanice.
Wonderful.
Hi,
Thank
everyone.
you. And can we go to the first question, please?
Sure. So we have a first question from James in London. And James wants to know what experience and qualifications are required to become a data protection officer.
Wonderful. So Sarbojit and then Etienne.
Hi. Thank you, James, for the wonderful question. The experience and qualification for a DPO for UK, because I think since you're from London, of course, you will need some standard experience, but you should not, or you do not be a law professional. You do not need to be. If you know about the organization that you will be working for, is great. And the other qualification now, which is that you need to have, is the certified DPO program that is there. So if you pass that, I think that will be the best qualification to have, other than any other academic qualification that you would have. And for the roles that that you have to fulfill, they are as per the GDPR article, I think it was 39. So these are things quite general, and I think that people who has got some experience behind them, they will be very good for this position. And if you are new, then of course you can go through this certification and come into this profession. Thank you.
Wonderful, thank you. And Etienne?
Yeah, so the data protection officer role is interesting because I'm coming to you from South Africa. And here we have the Protection of Personal Information Act. And we have a similar data protection officer role. And although there's no specific educational qualifications or requirements to take on that role, as Sarbojit said, it's a really good idea for your DPO or data protection officer to understand your organization's information and where it comes from. So that experience of your organization is always going to come in handy. And then in terms of qualifications, I would suggest 27001 information security, also a good one to have, because a lot of the information security controls relate to protecting information and protecting data. So for me, that would also be a useful one. There are qualifications in GDPR awareness and things like that that can also help.
Wonderful, thank you. And Lynnette?
Oh, thank you, Shanice. So I think although there are no prescribed qualifications that you do have to have certain professional qualities. And I think one of the main ones has to be good communication. You have to be able to be articulate when you're describing to the data subject how you're processing their data, and be open and transparent, but also be able to report at a board level your company's risks associated with your processing and ensure compliance. But, and other, qualities that good time management, good attention to detail. I think probably communication is the key.
Wonderful, thank you so much, Lynnette. And Suchitra, can we have the next question, please?
Yes, of course. So the next question is from Tina Harris. Isn't it everyone's job to protect personal data and not just the DPO? Are they the ones accountable for how the data is stored and processed?
Wonderful. So we'll go to Etienne and then Sarbojit.
Yeah, for me, I think protecting information inside an organization is everybody's responsibility. It comes down to implementing the right controls in your organization to provide the right levels of protection for confidential information, for personal information. And so anyone that is processing or working with or has access to that information has a responsibility towards protecting that information. So I would say, yes, it is everybody's responsibility. The DPO does have a specific role, but it is everyone's responsibility at the end of the day.
Wonderful, thank you. And then to Sarbojit.
Hi. Yeah, absolutely. The responsibility is everyone's, but the accountability is with the DPO. The DPO and his team, they are accountable to the law professionals, to the regulators on the amount of data they collect for any individual, whether that will be their employees or anyone in the customer or outside. And all such sensitive data, they are responsible for it and they're accountable even if they are sending it to data processors outside the organization. So they have to be accountable for each and every state and each and every part of the data.
Wonderful, thank you. And Ramiah?
Okay, thank you. Basically, I will start off with this way. When you talk about data, there are, in any organization or enterprise, you have personal data and also company's proprietary data. So here, let's start off with the personal data here. This is the focus today. And you look at any organization, there are basically three groups of people. They have the users, whoever is using any to access the database or Apple users. Then you have the so-called IT people, the custodians who are taking care of the application system. Then the other party, the person who owns the data. So in this case, let me give an example. When you have personal data, most organization who's a interface to collect the data. Basically, with the salespeople, they are collecting the data. And then you have the HR collecting employees' data. So this is two main streams of data coming in. So the salespeople, who do they report to? They report to the maybe the director of sales or marketing, HR. They report to HR director. So HR director is accountable for the personal data. Then you have the sales director accountable for, because anything goes wrong, this is the party going to answer. No? If the regulate, like in the say, GDPR, then they will go for this thing. So the DPO, you can say the person who's the intermediary, he is helping the company to ensure that people assess the data, they are following the policies, like say they only authorized parties can access the information. In summary, accountable will be owners of the data. No? DPO is a party who's responsible for making sure that whatever policies are laid down and being followed now. Okay, thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And David?
Yeah, thanks. I think it's different levels of responsibility and accountability. Me as an end user, yeah, I'm responsible maybe on what my job role is and how I use data, but I'm certainly not responsible for deciding on the legal basis or how consent's collected on a website. I can only be responsible for, not leaving data on the train or accidentally emailing it to the wrong place. And that's also dependent on that I have the right tools to do this, I have the right training to do this, rather than just say it's everybody's responsibility. I don't believe it is. It's responsibility for whoever governs data to get the message across and make sure that the right tools and training are in place. It's very easy to kind of blame staff. Oh, you accidentally emailed all our personal databases to the wrong thing. Well, that kind of thing happens. And why haven't we put some tech in place to stop it, rather than just say, oh, you were kind of careless doing your job? So I kind of think there's different layers of responsibility and accountability. It's not the same accountability and responsibility depending on your role.
Wonderful. Thank you. Lynnette, then Etienne.
Right, thank you. So yes, it's certainly the DPO is responsible for, informing the company of their obligations, helping put the policies and processes in place that all staff need to follow, raising awareness and training. So everybody who is processing data within an organisation is responsible for ensuring that they're processing it in accordance with the policies and processes in place. But ultimately, at the end of the day, accountability rests with the organisation as the data controller.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And Etienne, final thoughts.
Yeah, I just wanted to jump in and say that a big part of that accountability that lies with the DPO, or whatever the role is called, is to make sure that people are aware of their responsibilities. So DPO is ultimately accountable. At the end of the day, it's the organization that's responsible and accountable for that information. The people within the organization processing, using, accessing that information, accessing that personal information, have some level of responsibility. And a big part of the DPO role is creating that awareness and communication around what people's responsibilities are.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Great answers, everyone. And Suchitra, can we have the next question, please?
Yes, of course. The next question is from Ezra. Is the role of Data Protection Officer specific to the UK and EU? Or is this a role that should be considered by organizations internationally?
Wonderful. Sarbojit and then Lynnette.
Hi, Ezra. Well, for the purpose of GDPR, and because that is the oldest data privacy regulation across the globe and the most premium one, so it seems that DPO and other things come out of the GDPR requirement in EU and UK. But actually, this requirement of data protection officer is there across the globe for any nation who has this similar law, because end of the day there has to be someone, as we said in the earlier question, accountability. Like, we have the C-suite and the CEO is accountable for everything, and then under him or her there are each of these verticals or the function areas head who are accountable for their part. Similarly, data protection officer is accountable for his line of data protection. And it's a good governance thing to have a data protection officer. That is the reason that it has to be there, whether the law requires or not. I think it should be a part of a good practice.
Wonderful, thank you so much. And Lynnette?
Thank you, Shanice. So if you're an international company and you're processing EU or UK data subject data, then you need to comply with UK and EU GDPR as well. So if under Article 37, you need to appoint a DPO, then international organisations should also be looking at it.
Wonderful, thank you so much. And Ramiah?
Okay. So as far as from regulation point GDPR as well as the context of regulations in this part of the ASEAN, one of the regulation in the act, like Singapore, they have this called it Personal Data Protection Act, PDPA. It's more or less on the same lines as GDPR. So they have one of the act says that there need to be a person appointed in the act say, and they say this example will be the data protection. So by the act, you need to have a data protection officer. So you can say this something, a role, as long as you have a company, like say Singapore, Malaysia, Europe, they need to have a data protection officer. But when you have a company that's, say, international and multinational companies operating globally, normally what do they have? They have a global data protection officer from the US, example. Then for each country, they have a local data protection officers. So data protection officer role is required. Thank you.
Wonderful, thank you. David and then Etienne.
Yeah, and just the kind of added bit is if you are an international company with no establishment in the UK and the EU, yeah, you probably may need to consider what's Article 27 representative, which means you need a person or a point of contact in those countries where GDPR kind of queries can be forwarded.
Wonderful, great point, thank you. Etienne?
Yeah, from a South African perspective, we do a lot of business with European and UK companies. And so we do have certain requirements that have to be met in terms of GDPR because we sometimes process personal information of citizens from those areas. We also have our local equivalent of GDPR, and that is our POPI Act. It's similar in many ways, and the role is not a data protection officer, but an information officer. But essentially, the role is very similar. So, just coming back to the actual question, this is a role that is important, as Sarbojit said, in terms of good corporate governance, and it may be required. Might be a different name, but it would be required by your local privacy laws.
Wonderful, thank you so much. And to the audience, we can see there's quite a few of you online. So get those questions into the panel and we'll get your answers for you. Suchitra, can we have the next question, please?
We do have a live question from Kutluano Cow. Do short courses help to land a job role?
Wonderful. If we could go to Sarbojit and then Etienne.
Hi. Well, I would disappoint you a little bit here because short courses may help you to enhance and elevate your knowledge, but do they really land you to a job role? You think an employer will hire someone who has just a short course on a new knowledge area? The most thing is the experience in the job. And that, when accompanied with a good knowledge and a good education, that is the best combination to have. And that's the same thing for this data privacy area as well. For data protection, you might come from the end user, you might come from IT, you can come from law, you can come from sales, you can come from any other place. So you may need to be oriented about the law and the regulation and the stuff like that. So that is good. But you must have a good position and the role first, and then you can augment your knowledge. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And Etienne?
I think just adding to what Sarbojit said, it really is a short course on its own is not going to land you a role, but it could help you if you've got if you've got some background, you've got some experience, and courses that I suggest, maybe a GDPR awareness course or a 27001 information security course. There's also a add-on to the ISO 27001 standard that deals specifically with privacy, and that is ISO 27701. And even a basic understanding of that could certainly help to it'll contribute to getting the role. It's not going to guarantee it, but it will certainly give you a hand.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And Suchitra, next question, please.
Question from Stefan. How is data protection related to data information security, like in ISO 27001?
Wonderful. Thank you. David and then Ramiah.
Thanks, Shania. Yeah, we do a lot of work with companies on ISO 27001 and SOC 2, and there actually is a huge overlap. And it's one of those things, it depends on who you talk to. But reality is, for data protection, you need to know your information assets. That's a key component of ISO 27001. You need to control your supplier relationships, another key component of GDPR. You need to know how to handle a breach. I remember in 2017, we were doing some work for a big organization, and they had a breach. And somebody said to me, wow, your GDPR breach knowledge is really good. I've dealt with breaches for 20 years. Breaches didn't occur just because of GDPR. They've been happening all the time. There is a huge overlap. BCP, it's not necessarily explicit, but I know in our dealings with regulators, yeah, they're very keen that there's a good business continuity plan in place for GDPR. That's covered by ISO. So, and I think the key thing, I think Etienne mentioned that and Lynnette mentioned it, it's a great way to start governance. Without governance, it's very hard to manage any of this, security or GDPR.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Me, right?
Yes. Yep.
Okay, thank you. Okay, thanks, Etienne and David for it. So, data protection has been coming very hot, maybe the last 15 years, GDPR came in. But ISO 27001 had its history back in UK with the Department of Trade and Industry, that time they call it BS 7799. So that time really they were talking about information security. So when they talk about information security, data is one of the components. And ISO 27001, you look, they have controls related to asset protection. When you say asset protection, they are referring to data. When they're referring data, at that point in time, they identify personal data as well as complete proprietary data. And have additional controls on how people can access this data, logical access. So, and then they have teaching review. So, and ISO 270 also says in the clause 4, they also talk about external, internal stakeholders. So in that stakeholders, they also mention that you need to comply with regulations. So now with the this regulation related data protection like GDPR in, right? Now ISO 27 automatically has to take into consideration. There's a clause says you need to consider internal and external stakeholders. And one of the key things they say always must comply to legislations. So in that way, this definitely ISO 270 was already thinking generically, but now we did data protection. The only thing that you see a lot of emphasis because uh, when we GDPR and all these acts, now they have added this component called data breach. When the incident is suppose there's organization data is exposed, and then finally the authorities say is due to some issue, right, with the organization, then they levy fines. No? In the case of GDPR, they are saying 20 million euros or minimum 20 million euros. The worst case, 20 million euros or 4% of the revenue. No? So that is where they have added the so-called penalties. No? If not, ISO 2701 work perfectly with data protection. No? Thank you.
Thank you. And Sarbojit?
Hi. What I want to talk about is, yes, what my friends just talked about 27,000. Yes, of course, there is a very good part of data privacy which has overlap with security, and in security, that's where 27,001 and any other controls like CIS, or even it can be other controls of PCI DSS or anything that's required there. Now, in the whole of the data privacy, we have a few obligations around GDPR. Now, I know about there are regional laws like Singapore laws and others, they also have similar things. But since we are talking about much global, so I talk about GDPR, and maybe I can also talk about the California privacy law, which is from the US, or they may also be using HIPAA and other things. So most of the things that require data to be protected and ensure that the privacy is maintained. So that part, for data discovery or DLP, or for backup, or even for making it available to the data, the data, what do you call it, the person about whom the data is. So all these things do need a technology. So for that purpose, we do need ISO. The rest of it, there will have to be other components of policy and procedures which have to be implemented, and maybe service management would also be required there as well, because there is a thing of query of data and the change and all these things. So I would say that, yeah, there is a requirement of many other regulations, or 27,000 and maybe 20,000 as a standard, which can augment the data privacy laws.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And Etienne?
Yeah, so 27,000 is fairly broad in its scope, but privacy and protecting personal information would always be a part of that. There's also an add-on to 27,001 at 27701, and that deals specifically with creating a personal information management system or private information management system, which is would be part of your information security management system. And then there is a new version of ISO 27001 coming out later this year. New version of 27002 is already published. And the new version of 27002 and 27001, they have a new control, which is the privacy and protection of personal information. So certainly 27001 has a huge overlap with protecting personal information.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Suchitra, can we have the next question, please?
Question from James Roberts. What advice would you give to a DPO to prepare for a data breach?
And if we go to David and Lynnette after.
Great, thanks. Probably the first one is make sure you've got good communication lines with all the relevant stakeholders who are managing that breach. And number two, kind of make sure that you have at least a templated data subject risk assessment in place rather than trying to invent it at 3 a.m, because that'll be too tough. And I think it's one area where ISO 27001 does confuse auditors, because the risk assessment is how to protect the company against risk. Data protection is how to protect the data subject against risk. And sometimes it can look like those risks are in conflict. So that's why it's kind of useful, I think, to kind of keep them separate and make sure that you've got that risk assessment, because many of the breaches that we see, unfortunately, are generally caused by third parties. And if you ask a third party, you go, what's the risk to the data subject? they'll get a one line back saying, oh, it's kind of pretty low. In which case, we normally send them a very detailed data subject risk assessment and say, fill this out and get it to us, in the next few hours. So at least we've got a template to work with and work out what actually is the risk to the employees, to the customers, et cetera, et cetera. I think that's the kind of key role for a DPO.
Wonderful, thank you. And Lynnette?
Thank you. I think you have to have a documented process in place ready. Like David said, it has to include a risk assessment at the first stage, but you also need to decide beforehand who the roles and responsibilities are going to be with. Make sure you have a communication strategy in place if you do have to communicate with the data subjects or other external stakeholders. And most importantly, if you don't have a data protection officer in place, who is going to be responsible for communicating with the ICO if indeed you need to, following your risk assessment.
Wonderful, thank you so much. And Ramiah?
Okay, thank you. Basically, when you talk about data breach, before data breach happens, incidents happening, where's the information that got exposed? First, you look at the incident. That primarily starting with the security guys, information that ISO 270 people will be having the incident handling process. The moment it's confirmed is this data that is exposed is related to personal data. That's where you engage this DPO come in, say, look, there's a data breach. And already in the companies today, they have escalation process, where say if a normal data incident happen, the company got escalation matrix, from here to the CIO, to the CEO and all that. Now they have to also add in now for data breach. Now they have to look to the regulators, What I'm trying to say here, or what I said, we need to look at what you have in place in the company and then leverage on the current processes and see how you can bring this thing into the data breach, like say. So that's where Lynnette said this portion on communication. In the companies, most big companies, they also have this thing called disaster recovery plan. They have to communicate to the entities, So they already have some crisis communication. Look at all these sources of information, then you can make out a template. And then now this can just to customize it for informing the authorities. No? So that means in summary, DPO has to work with the security guys to know what's the incident. And then because it's a data breach, confirm, then follow the protocol procedure to say, initially you tell the authorities, say, look, we are investigating the incident. Why? Because today we have Facebook, Google, everything. Sometimes people will be telling to the authorities, look, my company, this data company in the data has been exposed. But the CEO in the company does not know. So that's where you have to have the communication plan and accordingly update now. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And Sarbojit?
Yeah, but the question is on how to prepare. So I would say the first thing is, yes, we have to be proactively have a plan of what should happen. As David said, you cannot do things at the early morning, when things really has happened. So before that, having a response plan, and as Ram said, it's about incident management. That's true. So this is also another type of incident where we have to know what we should do in terms of communication, validation, whether it's really a data breach or not, and then what are my obligation to the regulators and also to other stakeholders, and then we have to proceed as what the policy and the procedures demand us to do, and follow that. So having a good preparation, get everyone into the room and talk about it and form it with the buy-in for all the stakeholders in the organization is, I think, a very good preparation to start for data breach.
Wonderful, thank you so much. Great answers, panel. Suchitra, can we have the next question, please?
We have a live question from Penny Hayes. Under the new data reform bill currently in consultation, the UK government has confirmed that the bill will remove the UK GDPR's requirement for small organizations to have a DPO but will still need a data protection lead. Can this role be outsourced?
Sarbojit, Lynnette, and then David.
Well, the current GDPR does say yes, the role can be outsourced. One person can be the DPO of multiple organizations. So if the law changes in UK, well, I am not an expert in UK law though, but I can say that even if they take out the role of the DPO, but someone who has to be the go-to person, the accountable person, and that person role will remain and should remain. And today's world, because of outsourcing, I don't think the regulators will be very unjust to not to allow that. So I would expect, Penny, that you can bet on that.
Wonderful, thank you. And Lynnette.
Okay, thank you. So although this may come through and the requirement be removed for small organisations, I think it's important to note that the role of the DPO is also based on the complexity of your process and activities. So if you're processing large-scale sensitive data or criminal offence data or large-scale monitoring, I think it would still be a requirement to have a DPO, even under just a voluntary basis, because of how important the role is based on the complexity of your processing activities. But again, as it is now, you can outsource that role.
Wonderful, thank you so much. And David?
Yeah, I think maybe this has probably always been the case because the DPO's role strictly, they should have no conflict of interest. So they shouldn't be running an operational capability where they have to take their own advice. And for small companies, it may not even be possible for that role to exist purely. It would have to be somebody reasonably senior who's actually sort of marking their own homework. Virtual DPOs or the equivalent have existed. And as Lynnette said, I think the criteria for it in the UK can be a little bit vague. If you are a DPO in Estonia, it's, I think, 15,000 records. So it's very binary whether you need a DPO or not. So there are a lot of grey areas on what actually triggers a DPO for many commercial businesses. So outsourcing it, I think, and virtual DPO is probably the best scenario because I don't think small companies generally will have enough resource to be able to have a segregated person.
Wonderful, thank you so much. And Ramiah?
Okay, I think David already has answered what I wanted to say. Thank you, David. But basically, what I can say is that the way the world's going is leveraging on skills, So leveraging on skills means you try to look who's the best party to do it. For small SMEs, they are more focused on the direct delivery of services. Coming to information security, they are outsourcing it. So now come to the role of a data protection officer is actually also related to what the information security guys are doing. So if you look, if you can do outsourced security to a third party, right? Just remember accountability still remains with the organization. So that means you can also outsource the DPO function to outsource third party. But accountability, suppose a data breach happens, the company still has to bear the risk. Only the outsourced party is responsible to execute. And in the case, assume that finally the issue was with the outsourced party was not able to maintain the data in a secure way, and the regulators will just go for that particular area. Overall, paying the fine will remain with the organization. So, in summary, yes, the role can be outsourced.
Wonderful,
you.
thank you so much. Thank you. And Suchitra, can we have the next question, please?
Question from Oliver. We can all agree data protection is important, but how do you balance this need without interrupting or unnecessarily prohibiting operations?
Lynnette, then Sarbojit.
Thank you. I think it's important that before you start any new process and activities, any new project, if you have data privacy, right, design and default from the very start, then there'll be no need to interrupt or prohibit any process and activities once they've started.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And Sarbojit?
Hi. Yeah, hi. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Hello. Yeah. So my point is, of course, what was mentioned right now, that's correct. But the other thing is data protection or privacy protection, and at least from GDPR and many other laws, they come from the the rights of individuals. So whenever it is about the right of an individual, so there the thing is much more than just a data. It is about the basic primary right. So for that respect, this is also utmost important. So we cannot say that interruption of the operations. In fact, if we do not do that properly, it will cause interruptions in a very bad way if things are not done right. If a data breach happens, then the consequences for the organization can be really, really large. And that can not only interrupt, but can take some organization out of business. So that means we have to be very concerned about it.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And David?
I think part of this is that IT is still kind of in a very youthful phase. Every other industry that we have in the world, from airplanes to cars to food to medicine, is heavily regulated. They regulated planes in 1926 because too many planes were crashing and killing people. You know, would you call that an interruption as part of your business? Maybe, maybe not. We had to do the same in, was it the 70s in the UK with seatbelts because people wouldn't follow safety precautions and put on a seatbelt. It had to be mandated. Every other industry, food, would we say, oh, you're just a small restaurant, therefore food hygiene's not that important, we'll let you off that one? It doesn't happen. And I think really, you know, we are now seeing that IT is becoming regulated, because I think the one thing we all know is IT is totally unsafe. And, you know, that's why we have GDPR, which is a data protection law. I think it mentions data privacy twice, only in the footnotes. So it's a kind of add-on. You can't do data privacy unless you have data protection first. And it's coming of age, but it's slow. You know, we've seen some big fines, but what we see a lot of is actually the due diligence component. Big companies are not willing to do business with smaller companies unless those smaller companies can fulfill the requirements effectively of ISO and GDPR and any other data protection legislation around the world. So I would kind of call that a bigger interruption of business, that you actually can't get the business because it's not being done.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And Suchitra, next question, please.
Question from Matthew. Can the responsibilities of a data protection officer be shared amongst different roles in an organization, or should these be consolidated into one role?
Etienne and then Sarbojit.
So, speaking from a South African perspective in terms of our local privacy laws, the roles can be delegated, and you can have deputy information officers appointed. So our local law requires every organization to register their data protection officer or their information officer, it's called here, with the information registrar, and then their deputies may be appointed. So you can share the responsibilities.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Ramiah?
Okay, thanks. So basically, when this depends on the complexity of the organization. So if you have a small organization, then you have one specific role, and you look at the organization, like say a company, say of 50 people. Where is data collected? Is it mostly in personal data or a lot of sales data. And from that, you assign a person who's if it's more on customer data, then you can get a person who's related to sales to be the DPO. Ideally, in a company, you have a legal person. That's the best person to take on the role. I can tell you from the real life experience, legal people don't want to take this role, no. So they find this role not challenging or whatever. Next is to look for compliance people, no. Compliance people can be the next group of people. If you don't have them, then you try to get the people in HR or sales, no. The last person to take on this role will be the so-called IT people. Next question is, should you be only one person taking on the role, or can it be across different people? So if the case in a company, you have big organization, there is data being collected in different entities, right? Then you have to, it's good to have a so-called a EPO for each business unit, SBU. Then you have at a corporate level, one data protection officer. In summary, yes, it depends on the organization. Certain places you have to have multiple what they call the DPOs reporting to a so-called corporate DPO. Or some places, a small organization, it can be consolidated. So we need to look at the organization and then can advise accordingly. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Sarbojit, final thoughts on this one?
Yeah. So as the question has been the responsibility, and we discussed it earlier as well, the responsibility can be and has to be shared because the DPO cannot be split into many places at the same time doing the job, and especially the case that Ram mentioned that about a global organization where there is a need for people. So a DPO or a data protection team has to be there, headed by the data protection officer who is overall accountable, but the team will have to do the job, and the people who are on the ground will have to take up their own responsibilities to get the organization comply to the requirements of any regulatory requirements which might be there for the land.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And I think we've got time for one more question. So Suchitra, can we have the last question, please?
We have a live question from Galilee Lando. Is there any advice on what courses, short or long, are available?
Wonderful. Thank you. Ramiah?
Okay. So this is basically coming from Galileo or Okay. So we need to look at this. If you want to go into data protection area, right? You need to start from. Yes, you have to attend courses, very important. But you assume the assumption here is that you're already working in a place, right? Look at in your current organization where you're working. How are you dealing with data? You ask yourself, no. Like say are you as an end user, or are you like say are you doing any review, or are you in HR now? Assume that you are an HR role, right? That's where you're really handling personal data, right? So next question you ask yourself now, what you type of role you want? You want to be a data protection officer, or you want to do related to say data, like this now you like what David said, data protection and data privacy. You know. So where do you start? Because you say short and long courses, right? If it's a long course, like say you go for a 3 month to 6 month course, they teach you the basics about what's personal data. Then they will tell you about how do you protect this data, how to set up the policy and processes. Right? You want to know all these things, then you go for a long course. But if you're going for short courses, that means you need to have some you already know something, then you go for short courses. So if you are starting fresh, then recommend to go for a long course, say 3 months. Okay, thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Sarbojit?
Yeah, I would like to take Ram's word a little further. That is now data privacy is just not One thing, it's about having the policy procedures, having a communication set, having incident response, having set of disaster recovery, business continuity, and information security for the protection, as well as also today's date we see data portability. So that talks about data governance and also the application area. So there are wide ranges. Now, I would say, yes, if you are working in any one of these areas and you want to complement your knowledge gap in the other areas, as I mentioned, you can very well do that with short courses. And if not, then you may need to go for a long course. But if someone is working, that may not be feasible. So a fresh person can go for it. And today's date, I think even there is such courses for the universities are providing different diplomas and even graduate degree program, so they can really be mastering on this area of data privacy. Thank you.
Wonderful, thank you. And David, final thoughts on this one?
Yeah, I just kind of add on to what the previous panel members have said, is data protection is a never-ending learning. You need to read all the time, learn from all the time, find mentors to help you through difficult areas if you can. One course will never be enough. Probably 10 courses will never be enough. It's constant learning. What you learn in a course may not be kind of quite applicable in 6 months' time. Things are changing really fast. So it's just constant learning, constant reading all the time. And kind of going back to, I think, kind of what Lynnette said to start with, is getting the kind of governance in place, learning how to do governance. And I think the other thing, I think a couple of people said it, is communication skills, because unfortunately, DPOs are probably the bringers of bad news a lot of the time. And it's learning how to get that message to the board, to the staff, to customers, etc. Thank you.
Wonderful, thank you so much. Etienne, did you want to add anything to this?
Yeah, so I don't think I would be out of place if I pushed the fact that there is a APMG GDPR awareness course. So that is a really good one for beginners, for as a kind of awareness for your general staff. Everyone, as we said earlier, everyone has a certain level of responsibility to protecting personal information. So I would go GDPR awareness is probably a good foundation for everyone to kind of have. And then you can as a DPO, go and get the more specific communication courses, things like communication, learn how to communicate better, learn how to protect your data by having a look at things like 27,000 and David spoke about the importance of governance as well. Governance provides that kind of general oversight and that general accountability, and that's where it all begins. So maybe have a look at some governance courses too.
Wonderful, thank you so much. And we have unfortunately ran out of time. I know we could talk for ages and ages, but I would just like to thank all of our panelists that have been on today and our live audience for all those great questions. I'm going to go round to each panelist and get your closing remarks. So Lynnette, if we can start with you first of all.
Yeah, I just want to say thank you for having me. It's been great being on a panel with, the knowledge of all you guys has been excellent, and I really feel like I've taken something away from this. So thank you all.
Thank you, Lynnette. And David, your closing remarks, please.
Yes, great. Thank you very much. A great panel. Yeah, and I've learned a lot too. And I think the main thing about this type of role is always keep learning, always keep reading. There's always more to know. It's a huge subject, absolutely massive.
I agree with you there. Thank you. And Etienne, your closing remarks, please.
Yeah, so for me, I think it's important that we are aware of the general requirements kind of globally in terms of protecting personal information. It has become a hot topic over the last few years. It's become a lot more important. And countries that didn't have privacy information laws previously have them now. So I would say look at the general requirements globally, and then have a look at your local requirements. And as David said, it's a journey of continual learning. You're never going to stop.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Ramiah, your closing thoughts, please.
Thank you for having me today. As what Lynnette and David shared, this learning while part of this panel, I also learn. Learning. And another thing is that learning is a continuous journey. There's no such thing as we one call it yourself an expert. We are always improving. Like what David said, we are always improving and improving. So with that, I think this has been a great session. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And Sarbojit, your final thoughts, please.
Well, thank you so much for having me and the wonderful questions. And I would say thank you for all the listeners, participants who came. And because of your questions, we are here and we are able to learn. So thank you very much for giving us this opportunity to learn. So let us learn together.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Suchitra, your final thoughts, please.
I just enjoyed listening to the show and asking so many questions. We do have a lot more that need to be asked, so we should revisit this topic soon. And thank you to all the panelists.
Definitely. We could always talk for a much, much longer on Level Up, I'm sure. But I'd like to thank everyone for attending today. And over on our website, you can now search and view over 750 questions on APMG International. It's amazing to connect to over 100 experts from around the world. Don't forget, you can also listen to our podcast on all the major podcast platforms. We return on Monday, the 27th of June for another episode of Level Up Your Career, how to train everyone in service management for less than you think. Remember to subscribe to the show and we will send you a personal summary of what's coming up and how you can join us on the panel. Thanks, everyone. See you on the next show.